Hello, and welcome to Afternoon Tea with Karen. And now that the truth is a hate crime.
New South Wales Labor will this week move to criminalise speech that intentionally incites racial hatred following a spate of anti-Semitic attacks in Sydney. But LGBTQ organisations have urged the Premier to broaden the scope of the law reforms to include more vulnerable minority groups as well. For more, I'm joined now by CEO of Equality Australia, Anna Brown. Anna, we've seen a report in the Sydney Morning Herald today about these previously unreported attacks against the LGBTQ community. Can you tell us what we've seen? What are the nature of these attacks?
Yeah, well, sadly, our communities do experience hate and violence in quite unique and severe ways. Of course, hate and violence against any community is abhorrent. But what we've seen in recent months, and indeed over the last couple of years, is a disturbing escalation in hate, threats, online attacks, verbal abuse, harassment, and sadly, vandalism and bashings as well. So we've had spates of bashings in Sydney and, in fact, parts of across Australia in different states and territories targeting men using the Grindr app. And we've also seen, at its worst, these attacks getting with physical threats of violence and bashings in, for instance, Reservoir in Melbourne. A couple were attacked with a machete in Rundle Street Mall in Adelaide. A couple holding hands walking along the mall were attacked, and one ended up in hospital with their jaw broken. But it's extremely alarming, and in New South Wales we have really significant instances as well.
Now, the report points to the fact that many of these attacks have gone unreported. Was Equality Australia aware of these attacks and the nature of them ahead of that article?
Well, we work with the community every day, so we do hear reports from members of our communities, and we work with those community members. Primarily, we have to make sure they're kept safe and report to the police where appropriate. And in that way, we do get a view of just how great this problem is across not just New South Wales but the country. Sometimes, and I should say often, LGBTI groups and organisers of events don't feel comfortable coming out and speaking publicly because, of course, they're fearful of further attacks and assaults, and the reporting itself can sometimes generate further hate and further attacks. So it's something that we have to keep in mind, and it truly should be alarming to people out there to understand just the depth of the violence and hate out there against our communities.
And Anna, these attacks, they've prompted calls for Chris Minns not to proceed with hate speech laws being introduced to New South Wales Parliament this week following anti-Semitic attacks. Now, is Equality Australia also behind this call, and what's the reasoning behind it?
We very much support the laws. I don't think anyone's asking the Premier not to proceed. It's that they should be amended to include all communities impacted by hate. So hate against any community is abhorrent, and we need to ensure that we don't have an unfortunate hierarchy of protection where one community's rights and interests is protected and then others are not. And that's the law before the Parliament. We expect the law to be proposed this week in a way that protects against racial hatred, when in fact it should protect against all forms of hatred, including against LGBTIQ+ communities.
And it's also a Labor campaign promise. Another reason they won't be coming forward is the data that they used was from an anonymous online survey to justify changing all these laws, and I've done heaps of videos on that. So here's some history.
Well, at the moment, the threshold for hate speech is quite high. And what we do know from what the government has committed, they're going to look at lowering the threshold to make civil and criminal vilification easier to prove, so that people who are subjected to vilification are able to get better justice through our court system. So the government's committed to introducing legislation to ban the public display of Nazi symbols in the first half of next year. And this is important not only for the Jewish community, but also for our communities as well too. We were targeted by Nazis, and I think it's extremely important that we stand in solidarity with Jewish communities against the display of these neo-Nazi symbols that incite hate behaviour. As to the other portion of work, so addressing our anti-vilification laws, there's a less clear time frame on that. And one of the things that we'll be doing is pressing the government to ensure that this is addressed as soon as possible. Nobody should have to suffer a day more of hate.
All right, now the Australian Christian Lobby has today defended a post on its website which many say likened gay marriage to Nazi atrocities.
The cowardice and weakness of Australia's gatekeepers is causing unthinkable things to happen, just as unthinkable things happened in Germany in the 1930s. These are some of the final words of a blog post by ACL director Lyle Shelton. Earlier in the post, he claims changing the definition of marriage and teaching our kids their gender is fluid should be opposed, as it's stuff like this that's weakening our moral compass.
Australians know that these sorts of remarks are completely unnecessary and will have a really negative impact on gay and lesbian people.
Members of Australia's Jewish community have also criticised the post.
It belittles the atrocities and the extermination of 6 million Jews and millions of others, and it insults the memory of the victims and the survivors.
Shelton's post also slams the Safe Schools program and says it teaches kids that only you can know if you're a boy or a girl. No one can tell you. This is actually a direct quote from a children's book that's entirely unrelated to Safe Schools.
When I wrote The Gender Fairy, I wrote it for my son who's transgender. People like Lyle Shelton have used it against Safe Schools, saying that it's a Safe Schools resource, which it's clearly not. When you hear our children being compared to Hitler, you have to think, how much lower can this go?
I think our language has strong enough words to criticise a position or a policy such as marriage equality or the Safe Schools program without debasing the historical record and without smearing the LGBTI community, who, by the way, were the victims of Hitler's regime.
And it has been to Holocaust court that trans people of today are the same as the trans people that Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld cared for during the Holocaust. His institute was sacked and his books on sexology were burnt by the Nazis. So that's why if you're against the children's books with sex stuff in them, they call you a Nazi because of that bit of history. And the most important bit about it going to Holocaust court already, because someone said no, they weren't, and it went off to court and it was proven yes, they were, is that they were psychiatric patients of the good doctor. Mm. Another thing to notice is no one still is discussing the Q, let alone the plus. So queer theory, the followers of Judith Butler.
For me, Jewishness and the reading of the Talmud, for instance, it's all about disputation. It's all about having a raucous dinner table and people having different points of view. Nobody has ever said, oh, you must have this point of view to be Jewish. That would be highly contestable according to the protocols and the spirit of the debate that I know from my Jewish education. So I remain very strongly identified as a Jew, and I'm lucky to have a progressive synagogue in Oakland, and I belong to Jewish Voice for Peace. It's extremely important for me to be Jewish. I have Jewish values, and I read Jewish literature and philosophy still, so I never really abandoned that formation. But I haven't been a Zionist for, I don't know, goodness, maybe 40 years.
Okay, so I would like to, therefore, welcome everybody to the meeting, whether you're watching on Zoom or whether you're here in the room. And I would like to, with no further waste of time, introduce Michael. Michael's going to speak for 30 minutes, after which we've got lots of time for discussion. Then Michael will come back at the end. Michael, over to you.
Okay, the first thing I really want to talk about today is the title itself, because it looks like it's a battle between two very, very opposing sides. And while we do have arguments and discussions within the movement, it's very, very important that we locate that in terms of what is happening in the world today, because the far-right forces across the world are attacking LGBT plus people, gender ideology, gender studies, all the courses where people talk and discuss ideas, and queer theory itself. So I think it's very important that we start by saying that we side with those people who are under attack, and we should stand in unity with anyone who comes under attack because of their queerness, and that we are against people like Orban in Hungary, the Polish government, Trump and his cronies and allies in the US, and so on. And that is really important. And, locating that in Britain today, I think it's very important to... Sorry, that's not... There you go. It's very important to understand what is happening in terms of the attacks in Britain, because these aren't my family photos, but they are. This was last week, which saw the fifth standoff between the forces of the far right and those counter-protesting to defend drag queen story time at the Honor Oak pub in Lewisham, South London. And I think in some ways it's the custom of drag queens telling stories to young people is in some ways a typical strategy that comes out of queer theory and the idea of queering. The idea of queering something like the reading for pleasure. It's the idea of disrupting norms, creating situations that question heteronormativity. And like so much of queer activism, it emerged in the US, initiated by Michelle T in San Francisco in 2015. And drag queen storytime has become the target for right-wing groups because they see it as a fertile area to attack and create division and gain popularity for themselves in terms of linking LGBT plus issues with grooming and paedophilia, and a way to attack gender ideology across the globe. And you can see the sort of people who were faced up to us last week down in Lewisham. A collection of hard right people, ex-Nazis or Nazis, and people who used to be in Combat 18 and Bloods and Roses, awful people who are trying to turn the anger in society against LGBT plus people and divide us. So in that sense, it's fundamental that socialists stand with the oppressed against the right, defending events like Drag Queen Story Hour.
Now, back to the survey was conducted between the 17th and 25th of April through the collaboration between the Trans Justice Project and the Victorian Pride Lobby. So the Trans Justice Project, I've done heaps of videos on this as well. In the Fueling Hate report, the project team. So we've got Hero Badge, Jackie Turner from the Trans Justice Project, Austin from the Victorian Pride Lobby, and Nirvana from the Pride Lobby. Pride Lobby was set up to be an activist organisation. Anyway. And that will do. See you later. Bye.